It says minus web handlers because someone else was going to present on web handlers, but I'll pick that up a little bit as well. So what did we do in OpenEdge 12 basically, and what I find most interesting, because I already made this slide. This might just be the most arbitrary session title of all times, because how can I decide what are the most important things in OpenEdge 12, right? Depends on whatever it is that you guys need. So it's my own quote. But you know, I needed to decide on some things. So there are some things that we can mention, and some things I can show. I think from a personal standpoint, and also what I see out there, there are quite a few things. So web handlers, I definitely agree with Mike. You know, the what is it? The best thing since sliced bread? Yes, exactly. It is true. You know, it offers you so much flexibility, and I will show you in a bit what that contains. But it is really powerful. Next to that, we did something for collections. It's part of our whole getting more generics into the object-oriented ABL. Right now we have list collections. That's what we started out with. Then we introduced something called sorted collections, and I think with 12.7 we will be releasing hash map collections. But I'll show an example of that as well. Of the collections at least. This one is actually a .NET Core support. I think it's an interesting one. It will allow you to run .NET, for example, .NET libraries together with your application server on Linux. So containerized, for example, because we do not support Windows containers, but we do support Linux containers. But if you have a Windows, you don't have a Windows container, you in the old .NET world, so to say, you weren't able to use that in a containerized way. But now that we're improving that to also have the AVM on Linux support .NET, and obviously that's .NET. You know, it says .NET Core, but it has already been rebranded again to .NET 6, 7.7, etc. So they decided again to go back to the normal numbering. Anyway, so that's an important thing. I think there's actually posted today by one of the engineers that they are again this sprint, or their PI, they are again releasing a little bit of this in terms of an early software access. So that might be an interesting one for people if they want to, you know, play around with it a little bit. And that is actually the part where you should be able to run stuff on Linux. Before we already did the open client support for .NET Core. That's already available since 12 or 12.5, something like that. Anyway, it's all part of the getting rid of the .NET framework, and we're not doing that. But it's obviously it's Microsoft that wants to get rid of that, and they have a new version. So we have two things called unified logging and deferred logging. So I wanted to put some TESOE in there, and as I mentioned already, there's some things there. And deferred logging is an interesting one because it touches a little bit on the OE manager as well. So that might be an interesting one. And unified logging, I will come back to in a bit. Then we also have the resizable arrays, and then you'll say, yeah, how exciting is that? Other languages already had that. Yes, but we haven't for like ever. So therefore, it's still interesting. You know, everyone needed to go and, you know, loop it, remove it, check whether it was actually already set or not. And you know, you don't have to do that anymore. You can just resize it as you go. And I think that's still an improvement. You know, but is it a big improvement? Again, that's arbitrary. Yeah.
You just keep that event string.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's true.
Why you just keep it?
No, yeah, because I wanted to handle it separately, but it's okay. So yeah, this is an important one, but that's my opinion again. I do see a lot of customers and partners, and I do see a tendency with the enterprise architects within those companies is that they want to do something with event-based. You know, what that is still undecided, but it's pretty likely that if they're doing that, that Kafka is going to be a part of that, or similar to Kafka. Azure has sort of similar event streaming things now. So will AWS, and so will every cloud provider will come up with, but Kafka is still sort of the de facto standard for the moment. So I see quite some interest here, because it also means, that's my impression, is that what you could do, you could quite easily, with limited effort, by putting sort of this stuff in the right places within your code base, you could easily make your very old OpenEdge application, let's call it old or legacy or whatever, and still be part of an event-based architecture within the company, you know, because every data event, maybe it's a data event, maybe it's something else, doesn't really matter. Maybe I create an invoice from your application. You're in retail, so someone buys something, and I want that event to be captured somewhere. So right now, that makes it very easy, because basically you can say, okay, maybe you already, and I'm not saying this is a good idea, but maybe you already have a write trigger defined. You could put in code that also basically publishes that event to an event queue of some sort, in this case Kafka. And in turn, there doesn't have to be, again, an integration between applications, because you don't care anymore. Here's my event, and do whatever it is that the second application wants to do with it. I just need to make sure is that I send over the right thing. But if you combine, for example, these two, it can be interesting if you're going to, for example, thinking of, let's talk microservices. So I have one service, an OpenEdge service, that's the invoicing service, and at some point I might want to have all of those events, and I want to list those first, or sort those in a certain order before I send them to the event streaming, for whatever reason. And you can also, and because collections, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, so actually collections, the biggest, well, it's not the only difference, but the biggest difference is, a lot of people say, yeah, we're doing sort of the same thing now with temp tables in OpenEdge. But the problem with temp tables is that you can only store an ABL, a very generic progress object in there. You can't have a type. So that means that every time you want to get maybe a serialized object from there, you need to cast it first, basically, to whatever it was. And it, of course, you need to be aware of what it was. But if you're doing this, basically you can just make a collection of a certain type, your own class, whatever that may be, put in those objects there and serialize them straight away, or send them to serialized to the Kafka event streaming, and then another OpenEdge service can just say, okay, I'm going to get that serialized class, deserialize it again, and then I can work from there. So basically, in that case, you go over boundaries from one application or one service to another service. You know, we're not talking applications anymore, we're talking service to service. Why not? You know, it opens up a lot more possibilities of doing things that you could potentially already do with temp tables. It just makes it a little bit more easy and readable as well, because you know exactly what types you're dealing with as soon as you're working with those. So that is the one thing, and then I have, so, and I just wanted a little bit of the part two. So obviously this was a big thing for several reasons. The multi-threaded database that we introduced in 12.0 already and improved on that. Why is that interesting? Because it enables us to do the server-side join resolution, which means we're doing more stuff server-side if you have complex joins. So for each, those kind of constructions, multiple tables, and join them on the server side instead of getting everything client-side first. So you have a gigantic data set that you're sending over the line, and then you're only starting there to basically reduce it to the set that you to actually resolve the query there. That was 11.7, and now in 12 we do that server side. We also introduced a little bit of server-side actions as a sort of a tryout functionality. So you have the action functions, but you now also have the accumulate function, and the difference is that one is client-side and the other is server-side. So you can actually say, okay, to the server, I want you to accumulate these records back to my client. Obviously, that all helps performance. And there might be other things that we can now do server side, because really what we were doing, we were not doing anything server side from a database perspective before. You know, it was really like just waiting for whatever the client sends us. We're doing that. We're returning the result. Well, very big result, and the client will resolve whatever it is that query is. But now we can think of maybe in a separate thread, the database could be accumulating totals for table. I don't know. Is that interesting? I had a discussion in Sweden with one of the guys who said, so we now have to do that ourselves. He said, so we want to basically also keep track of subtotals with several rules, right? Like I want to have, okay, financial application, and I'm doing all sorts of financial transactions, but I have them on a general ledger account level, but there's also a cost center level, those kind of things. So then maybe you want to do stuff server side saying, okay, why can't you calculate for me what the total is on the cost center level? So that I don't have to do it anymore. I can just straight away ask the database what is the accumulation for that sort of sorting that I'm requesting, and then it will come up with a total. That is sort of the stuff that you could do potentially server side. Can't do it yet, but that's a possibility. So it opens up a little bit of things where we can think of what is stuff that we can now do on a separate thread with the database without blocking what actual people or the actual clients are doing, because that in the past it would basically mean if we would be doing that in the background on the same thread, it would basically block other people from doing stuff. So this is an interesting one and enables a whole can of worms for us, basically see what we can do, but you know, and still this deserves always a little bit of extra attention. If you're running your application server in a shared memory modus or with a self-service connection, then this does not apply, because this all happens in shared memory then anyway. So you'll never get the same performance as with a shared memory connection, which you are still allowed to do, you know, but that has other implications in terms of if the application server fails or shuts down or crashes like hell, then it takes down shared memory and then the database crashes as well. So it's I think Docker, yes, we did already support some Docker in 11.7 something, but to be quite honest, it wasn't up to par as it is right now. We have our Docker images available for the database since 12, so something. I can't remember from the top of my head, but there's also the Pesui Docker image that you can use. We have sample applications, and this is also where for example, the unified logging comes in. You're not restricted to do that using a container, but we have examples doing that using a container. Another one, the health scanner, which is important if you're going to do any sort of form of load balancing of your Pesui instances. You need to know whether that thing is healthy. Well, your load balancer needs to know whether that thing is healthy. So it needs to ping every interval that you decide on, basically, and it will ask your application server, are you still healthy? And you can define basically rules in here saying what defines whether it's still healthy. You know, I can set, for example, a maximum of a memory limit to this. It's an interesting one, because at some point you can imagine that you're saying, okay, I don't want my application server to use more than 4 gigabytes of memory, right? And if it uses more than that, I consider it not healthy and I want it to shut down, and I'll get another one out basically. Those kind of rules can be set within the health scanner. It's pretty easy. It's just another WAR file to deploy, and you need to obviously enable a property saying I want to enable the health scanner. It's just a thing that runs side by side of your OpenEdge application, doesn't really bother too much, and it will only return. We have few things. It will return a 200 or a 500 to your load balancer, so either available or not available, very simple. And you also have sort of the, we have some endpoints in there as well that could basically describe the metrics that it, you want to know why it made that decision, why it's healthy or not, and then basically you can still see, okay, so these are all of my values, so if memory is it, I'm gonna rate it. So it will always, for every item that you define, it will create a scoring mechanism. It will say, okay, so based on what you said 5 gigabytes of memory, it's now 4.7 gigabytes. It will give you an additional score. So it will score you in a certain way, and if scores combined mean, you're unhealthy, then it will return a 500. Otherwise, will return a 200. So okay, and yeah, that's basically where your load balancer can take stuff out of commission and basically go to the healthier ones. The online operations, there's too many to mention. There's a whole page in the documentation that shows all of the operations that we can now do online, and that's, by the way, that's database. Obviously, database operations that you can do online in this case. Obviously, there's also some stuff that you can do with PESOE online, but this is more about the database stuff. And we're still improving on that. The database team is trying ever so often to see whether they can, yet again, get closer to that goal where we can say we can do everything online. We're not quite there yet. It's very complex, but we're making it. And then there's the new var statement. Yeah, you can argue again. Is that a big or exciting change? I think sometimes it gets us a little bit closer to other languages that are doing stuff in a certain way. It can also reduce the number of lines of code, obviously, because you can combine a lot of variables on the same line, where you always have to use basically saying, okay, define variable, and then you can define one as character. And now you can basically say, and I'll show that, it's basically var comma separated list character, no, done. And then everything on one line. So all the character variables are defined on one line, all of the integer variables, etc., 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 etc. So I can probably combine some things. So let's have a look here.
Is there a plan to use it to define the variable at the first use? In C# you can do it at the first use. No plan for that.
Not that I know of, no.
Well, I think this is the first step. Yeah.
That could be.
So.
Yeah. So there are some things. So so I've got my own class here. Oh, sorry, you're not seeing that. Let's duplicate that for a second. That's readable, right? I think so. So I can basically say, so I have a class called myString, and I can basically declare it straight away. And there's also the sorted set. So I wanted to show both things in one example. So there's this declaration, which is always, and you can directly initialize the thing as well.
That's the way.
Okay, that's what you meant. Yeah, that's sorry. Yeah,
oh,
that's
cool,
that's actually the same. Yeah, so this works. This compiles, and it works, which is not always the same thing. As you can see, I'm doing a set here of my type, right? My own type, which is myString, and it's a type of string set. And there we go. New progress collections sorted set. Type myString. And the cool thing is that because a collection is an object on its own, it also obviously has functions that you can call on that, or methods that you can call on that object. Like, adding stuff to it. As you can see, so this is the add method. So I can say, okay, I want to create a new object, myString object, with this little Thomas, George, Paul, and John. And I have ways of, adding it and equalizing it, whether it's equal to false or true. I can count how many objects. So use things like iterators. So it's pretty easy to move through that list, for example, because that's all built-in functionality. So you don't have to build your own loops or go through.
You do it with repeat or for each? No, with repeat.
Sorry?
Only with repeat, not in C# you do it with for each, yeah?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. So that was another question.
Yeah.
People saying, okay, can we get it for each for the collections as well?
Yeah. And the nice thing is it's not important with the variable, but if you have new people, this comes from C# or from Java.
They know this.
They know this, and then it's like Java or it's like C#. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, like I said, it's not exciting in terms of it's something that no one has.
Yeah.
But it enables you to attract younger guys and girls who know this stuff instead of our for eaches, etc. etc. are not that well known. I love them. But but it's an interesting one. So it should compile, and it should also I guess it should be able to run as well. Let's see. Ah, George is already in the list, which is correct, right? We saw that. And there's a count of 4, and there's George, John, Thomas.
Thomas is wrong.
Sorry?
Must be Ringo.
Anyway, so these are just examples of the sorted sets. Like I said, we also have the list collections. Basically, you can easily sort stuff here. That makes sense, right? So, for example, alphabetically, but it could be anything. You can also create your own iterators.
Yeah. Okay.
Who will apply to their own rules. So this is a very straightforward.
How fast collections? How fast they are? As fast as temp tables or faster? Or slower?
I think they are a little bit slower.
Yeah. There was also the possibility to work with .NET connections, yeah, but they're relatively slow.
Yes, and then again right now you're limited to Windows, obviously.
Yeah, now you are independent, yeah.
Well, not yet, but we're working towards that. That's as soon as we have the full .NET Core support.
Yeah.
Then we should be able to.
Yeah, but the new connections are also running with Linux.
Sorry?
The collections here are running also with Linux, yeah?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
This is all good old plain ABL, so you can run this wherever you want.
Yeah.
The way you're used to it. Anyway, so I have this because this is an important one because we were comparing stuff. So I have my own comparer here, basically saying, okay, if there is a compare to, basically, I can decide whatever it needs to do with that. So it has a lot of, let's say, override possibilities, so there is a sort of a default compare to or comparable interface, and then you can basically create your own version of it, which whatever suits you. So that is that part. Then what I want to show is a little bit of the Kafka stuff. So what we did, you can create both things, right? A consumer and a producer. So is everyone aware of what Kafka is?
I know.
Nope.
I know.
Very good. So you could see it. So traditionally, a lot of people are using message queues for asynchronous delivery, basically saying, okay, so whenever something happens within my application, I want a message to be published, and that will send that to a message queue. And another application is just retrieving that message queue or looking at the message queue and seeing whether there's something which might be of interest to him. And that is your traditional MQ, active MQ, those kind of things, rapid MQ. So those were the traditional solutions. They have their limits in terms of, let's say, high availability, but also in terms of how much messages they actually can store in their queues. And we see that, we hear that as well from customers that, for example, ActiveMQ, if you keep sending on messages long enough, they will need to restart the whole thing at a certain point to get back to an acceptable performance of the solution, which is exactly what you don't want if you want this, because with asynchronous messaging, the most important thing is sort of a guaranteed delivery. Well, you're not getting the feedback that is actually being held by the, but you do want that to be available at all times, that whatever you send, whatever that message is, and in our now we're talking events. When we're talking Kafka, we're talking events. But it's basically still a message. But instead of Kafka offers you the possibility to store even binary objects within Kafka. It doesn't really matter. You can put a string in there. You can put a JSON object in there. Whatever suits you. Kafka is really built for the whole concept of being high available. It's clustered. The promises of Kafka actually that they say you will never need to delete anything that you put on me. And well, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that remains to be seen. But that is their promise. Basically saying, okay, put everything there. We think you should be able to keep it there. For example, if another application failed or needs to be rebuilt, you need to be able to rebuild everything from a certain starting point. So if you say, okay, so I've lost everything up to a certain point, I should be able to replay those events and still come back to the same end result that I was before. But that's the whole idea behind event-based architecture, is that you're saying, as long as I can repeat the events within my application, my service, it will always end up returning the same result based on all of the events in a certain order. So Kafka is one of those. So you can basically look at it as being sort of a box, and a box where you can put on things, and it's sort of a spinning wheel that keeps on going, and you can put new things on them. And everyone who puts something on Kafka, we call a producer. And everyone who's listening to Kafka saying, hey, maybe you have something for me, we call that a consumer. So basically now from ABL, you can say, okay, I can both create a producer, so that means from ABL or from, maybe I base it on data in my change data capture tables in OpenEdge. Maybe I do it based on a trigger. Maybe I do it based on whatever event I define in my ABL code. But at some point, I'm going to say I want to publish something to Kafka. And then basically, I can decide. So Kafka, there's two options. I can either report back to you that I've received your thing, which is always a nice thing, because otherwise you might have to send it again. But it doesn't need to. So if you do that, so basically you'll get a message back saying, okay, I've got your message, all good. And from that point on, and that's the whole idea here, is that you don't care anymore until you also have a consumer in ABL, written in ABL, and that consumer listens for a certain topic. Because with everything you produce, you always need to create something called a topic, and message is always part of the topic. And the topic could be anything what you decide it to be. There are no restrictions. You can name it anything, but most of the times it makes sense if it is something with the entity that it has to do with, let's say, invoice. So I'm just going to put invoice in there, and then I'll put in perhaps some sort of serialized class of an invoice with a status in it, and then basically, if I have another Kafka consumer in the ABL, I could say, okay, I'm listening for topic invoice, and the other publisher, the producer, actually produced a message saying, okay, so this invoice has been printed, but now it also needs to be sent. So there's a different service is capable of sending it to an email address. I don't know. Doesn't really matter. The idea is that this one, the producer puts in the topic invoice and puts in the serialized class, for example, of the invoice. And we have a consumer then for the other service basically saying, okay, so I'm going to listen. Are there topics of invoice? Okay, then I'll check, then I'll pick it, and I'll see whether that invoice, serialized invoice, I'll deserialize it and see what the status is. If the status is printed, I know I can do something with it. If it's not, I'll just leave it and it's done. You know, I'm not doing anything with it. That's sort of the idea here, is that, and the same goes, it doesn't need to be, obviously the consumer doesn't need to be an OpenEdge application, could be anything. Especially since there are a lot of sort of generic consumers already out there, which is very interesting. So we're thinking about using this as well for things like Pro2 that we sell as well, for data replication to other targets than OpenEdge databases. But right now we're limited by the data server, which only allows us to replicate to the Oracle and SQL databases. But a lot of people are requesting other things, MongoDB, Snowflake, Hadoop, you name it. We can't build data servers for all of those products, but all of those products do have Kafka consumers. So if we are able from Pro2 to send it all as data events basically to Kafka, then, you know, be my guest. You can let any consumer that you can find on the web consume the same event and do something with it. And what it does with it, that's the whole idea here, that's the consumer that decides whatever he wants to do with that data event. And you can potentially also purge stuff from Kafka, but you shouldn't have to, but you know, maybe it does make sense at times to do so.
May I ask,
Yeah.
how is the security? So can anybody get this event? So, I mean, you don't want that anybody can pick this.
So
invoice.
yeah, so obviously you can, to a certain extent, you can obviously secure your Kafka event stream, but that's then up to Kafka, and you'll need to provide something here as being able to send it with the right credentials, etc., to make sure that you can do that. But in practice, I do see is that most people use this internally only. So that basically means is that they don't bother, because it's also costing performance if you do that. So it makes sense, you know, just to keep it open and say, okay, whatever, if you're within my application landscape, everyone can just tap into it. And deleting, for example, then you need specific rights to delete things. So even if people could see it or get it, and also it depends again what you're publishing. Are you publishing sensitive data? Then you should be very aware of what you're doing there, because everyone could potentially read it and use it in a very incorrect way. So there's also the concept of transactions within Kafka, which is nice, because obviously we have the same thing in OpenEdge, right? So we might store two different records, but they're actually considered one transaction for maybe even two different tables or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But that's our concept of a transaction, and Kafka has a similar thing as well. So saying, okay, if I define a transaction being this, then I only accept that. So if one of the thing fails, then it knows I need to do some sort of rollback, because otherwise I have an incomplete transaction in the Kafka event stream. So for example, for Pro2, we don't really have that in that context, but we could then do that and say, okay, what if we're not, what if we're just replicating based on whatever a business entity which contains of several records, and I would use that and say, okay, I want to also to send that as a Kafka transaction, basically, as a producer to the Kafka stream. Then exactly the same happens, and you know for sure that, for example, in your SQL end, I'm just saying SQL here because that has things like constraints, and that it will not even consider getting the record because it's not there. Because if it's incomplete, SQL will try to write it into its database and will say, oh, that's not going to work because I need an order and an order line record for this to succeed. But you don't anymore, because a Kafka will make sure is that it will only end up in the Kafka event tree if it's a complete transaction. Now, obviously, that's the one.
One question is that this variable had the same name as the type, the record builder.
Yeah, that's probably not very useful, right? That's just Ruben writing code.
Is it case sensitive nowadays?
Sorry?
Is this case sensitive nowadays, or?
No, I don't think so. I think I can probably put in whatever I want here. This is just but this is not for that's for clarity. So that's why this was done. Is that I can see what the name is and what the class name is. But yes, you're right. This is not very well.
But the compiler doesn't complain about it.
No. Exactly. No, because it knows is that the first thing decides what type it is, and whatever you put in after that, it's just the name, which can be anything.
The same with temp tables, that you can have the same name.
Yeah, because I could say blot. That's also good. It doesn't really care. But this is not the best chosen name that I agree with. But it's also very easy, for example, in that case, to test. So you can do all sorts of stuff. So once, if we're talking Docker anyway, just quickly have a look. I think we have the Kafka. So basically, this creates a Kafka broker on my machine very easily. Always works. Okay. And then basically, I could check whether whether this actually works, right? Okay, so let's see. Of course. I recently updated my environment. anyway, I will come back to that later. Doesn't really matter. But you'll see this, that if I send this, basically it will send a, in this case I created my own event handler, and it will create a deposit, and from that deposit it will create a Kafka event and will send it to my Kafka broker. And then in turn I can start a consumer, which is the start consumer thing over here, and it will just start listening for a certain topic, and in my case I call it my topic, but like I said, it can have any name. In this case I'm also saying, so I expect a JSON response, because I'm also putting JSON on the Kafka stream. Depends a little bit, you know, it could be anything, so you should be aware of what sort of thing you're getting from Kafka. So that's the Kafka part, but I think it's still interesting, you know, is that even with older applications you can be part of an event-based architecture, and I think that's pretty powerful. Okay, and then let's do one of these older presentations that I found, because we don't have mics, but I'll just do mine here, and just to give you a little bit of a explanation on the web handlers. So what is a web handler? I think I sort of already explained it right. It converts HTTP into ABL, figures out what to run, performs request routing and parameter mapping. So basically any HTTP request that comes in to the web transport can be intercepted by a web handler, and that can basically do anything what it wants. And also return anything at once. So you could even receive an XML body from within an HTTP request and return JSON anyway. I'm just imagining stuff here. But there's a lot of things. So Mike, for example, and I think that's one of the things that he probably wants to show, he was able to create in a very generic and simple way on top of his framework that he already had, was able to create APIs to whoever wants to communicate with the framework, whether that's the GUI, whether that's a GUI, whether that's a web browser, whether that's something else, doesn't really matter. I have full control about, over the incoming message. So basically I can say, okay, I want to do something with that, but I also have full control over whatever I'm outputting back to the client, to whoever requested something from me. So we've got some in-the-box versions. They include the OpenEdge web handler. You remember this one? This is the one that is used for the web speed, for traditional web speed. So that's again just an implementation, right, of the web handler, but then one specifically made for web speed purposes. Then we've got a default handler, which is the locked out version. Basically, if you say that, nothing happens. So it's again sort of a security thing, and you can create your own, as I told you already. You need to add, to be able to use this, you need to add the OpenEdge.net.pl if you're doing that already into your protocol, otherwise it won't work. And there's an API documentation as well, which is for the which is part of the OpenEdge HTTP client documentation. It's a little bit different, but it looks a little bit more like an API reference than all of our other documentation. So it's pretty much what a lot of people will be used to. Which handlers use? So this is what you're looking at right now. Is part of the OpenEdge properties file. So whenever I create a web handler, I still need to basically map those to certain endpoints. those can be made with parameters, right? So I can say, okay, so this will be a sort of a flexible value, this is a hard-coded value, and a flexible value as well. And based on that scheme of the URL, it decides, okay, so if I'm getting a slash, okay, I'm just going to say something, slash shoes, slash catalog, slash blad, it will go to the sports handler. If it says customers catalog update SVC, then it will go to sports handler. So this one is far more defined than this one. So you always need to be very aware of how you arrange your web handler mappings. That's where a lot of people go wrong, because if you put one which is very flexible at the top level, then it will skip the other one, because it will always apply first to that one, because we'll say, yeah, because actually this one is exactly such a case, right? Because this and this is exactly what it says here, but then without the parameters. So it will still use this one. And in this case it doesn't matter, because they're both using the same. But if this was using not sports but shoes handler, this would never be reached, even if you're using this, because this one also applies to the top one. Of course, you can define that sort of stuff. You don't have to do that in the OpenEdge properties files. That's coming from somewhere, like you probably imagined. So I'll just switch my workspace here to the. Let's pick this one. And you can also use regular expressions, by the way. The idea here is that I can create whatever sort of filtering, sorting, paging, batching mechanism from a client side. I'm saying, okay, so this is my filter that I'm going to present to you, and it has a certain format. What we used to have before is we had very prescriptive ways of creating REST APIs and creating those kind of things, and they had a fixed filter mechanism, which was sort of a very OpenEdge one, where you would even send things like where, whatever, sort of, you were kind of giving away what your server was actually running. And the question is, do you want that, or do you want to keep it more generic? So basically I'm saying here is now, you know, your customer says, okay, so I want to do this based filtering, so I just want to have, and which is the most used, I think, is just basically saying, I'm going to say endpoint / customer. If I say / customer / one, I just want customer with the customer number 1. If I say customer /one / orders, I will get all the customers for customer 1. If I'm using customers / customers question mark, name is whatever, and city is whatever, I want it to be a filter and say, okay, I want to filter on name and city and want to show all the customers that apply to that one, right? That is what I find mostly used. But you could even build, for example, your own OData handler. So if you're thinking about creating an OData API from OpenEdge, you could do that, build a new web handler, because you have full control over whatever comes in and whatever you create as output. So if you create some sort of clause that says, so whatever my OpenEdge query results after, you know, retrieving the OData filters that I received from the client, and then I'm saying, okay, I'm going to transform that first using web handler and maybe an intermediate clause or object or whatever, then translate that into a progress query, return the results, and do the opposite again, saying, okay, now I want to parse that as being OData and parse that back to the client as being in an OData format. That's possible with this, but you can receive files, you can return XML that you want to do. It has, let's say, a default operation to web handler for all operations, right? So, like I said, the get, put, delete, post, etc., 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 and you can override those. Basically. So you pick that one and you say, okay, I have a method public override handle get, or handle post, or handle delete, etc., and then basically create your own. And there are 3 methods that you must implement: handle get, handle method not implemented, and handle not allowed. Basically a sort of a forbidden, not implemented. So you know, these very well correspond to the usual messages that you get from a client whenever you talk to a web API or whatever. But you want to implement more, like it says. So handle exceptions, handle all sorts of HTTP methods, whatever people are trying to do. It makes a lot of sense, for example, to say, okay, so if I don't want people to do, let's say, post or delete actions, then basically I'm saying, okay, then I will say, okay, good, that's my override then, and I will make sure is that it refers to the handle method not implemented or handle not allowed, because I don't want that to happen. Basically, I don't want my server even to do something with it. I want to respond straight away saying you're not allowed to do this, period. Yeah, obviously for the incoming data, there's the OpenEdge web request. Basically, it says, okay, I can do all sorts of stuff with it. I can get the URI query names. I can get the headers from it. I can get the cookie from it. Like I said, I have full control over whatever is coming in, which is far more powerful than we could do in the past. And so it's really cool. So, like this, you know, the filter. This was where I was talking about the ADL, where why would you want it? You know, who wants to know whether it's an ADL query or not? I don't care. It should be a filter, and the filter should be without context of where it's going. Well, that's my thing. Okay. So that was all in theory, obviously. I need to first. Again, otherwise it will drive me crazy. So just an example, and I can send it later on. I have this somewhere in a repository as well. This, for example, is, and I'll make sure that I get the. So as you can see, I created my own web handler, and that inherits from web handler, obviously. And I've implemented my own override of the protected method handle get. It always gets the PO request as the OpenEdge web request, which I just shown. And then I can do all sorts of very cool things with that, saying, okay, so for my, and that is for my API, I defined just what I told you. You know, I wanted to be able to do a sort of a very easy filtering, and I want to be able to have 2 entity names, so I can look up orders for certain customers, etc., 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 based on an ID even, which is then in this case, for example, the customer number should be anyway the primary index probably in this case, and this is where the actual URL mapping comes from. Yeah. This is where you define that actually, saying, okay, so I want to create a new service, transport type is web, this is one of those web transports, service name is generic API, and then I'll create a new web handler, or I can select an existing one, but I create a new one, generic service, and there I've done exactly that, right? So I'm saying, okay, so my URL always starts with API, and then basically, in this case, people can decide whether they want to retrieve the data or retrieve metadata. So it could be metadata in that case, because meta will return for a certain entity name. It will return what fields are in that entity. So that also tells me as a client saying, okay, now I know which fields I can filter on, for example. If you're looking at the OData format, that already has that kind of stuff built in. But yeah, this is and this, as soon as you save this, it will create those mappings accordingly in your OpenEdge properties of your linked Presley instance. Of course, that doesn't help you really much when you're going to a let's say production scenario where you want it to be, you want your pass instance tailored, and that's what I told you earlier about. Was the whole thing is that everything could be scripted, right? That's the promise. And if it can be scripted, it can be containerized. So let's just have a very quick look here. There we go. And then we look at the Docker file for this one example, for this one. And then you can see, and I'm doing far too many things here. I don't need to do that many, but just for testing purposes. But I can call that OE prop and call that and basically set properties like this. And this is exactly what it is. It's another property, right? So I can just edit here, and I've just added my handlers here as being able to parse that. And that basically ends up, if you then build that and publish it. I hope I still have it running. That's Z. I'm not doing HTTPS, I'm doing plain old. Oh, there we go. So basically this is what you end up with. So and I can do /1 for example, I can /2 and you get a different one. Obviously what I promised as well, I hope that it works. Don't know whether, oh there we go. So now I'm actually getting a customer record, but as well all of the orders of the customer. And I promised as well is that you could potentially say, okay, so what if we're saying, no, well, what is his name? Oh, country. What's in the Sports 2000? Oh, that's just, it's not Sports 2000 database probably. Country is, well, let's just say 24240. I don't know why that data is clean, but anyway, it does work. Could be used as well. So as you can see, I just I can query away. I can also do stuff like paging and those kind of things, because I can send a skip parameter, I can send a top parameter, I can send whatever I want, right? So that's basically what you're doing in the web handler, saying, okay, if I'm parsing that filter and part of that filter says, you know, I'm top or skip or whatever that is, then I can do something with that. And obviously I have some clauses in here that are doing those things. For example, filter params. So it goes through this and basically parses all of the filter parameters and it builds up a query string. So I can then actually go and fetch the correct data from there. But it offers you a tremendous part of flexibility, like I said, in terms of whatever you want to create in terms of APIs for anything, anyone. Are you using it yet? Yeah, probably.
I've presented a bit yesterday.
Ah, good.
Yeah. But I'm only starting it. Yeah. We have written a generic interface for the web handler, also for the old one. Yeah. So, but for the presentation here, I investigated a bit. Yeah. And this was really cool. I was really surprised how easy it is to work with.
Super easy.
Yeah. Really cool. Yeah.
And you can have more than one. Yeah.
So in this example, you could search for all the users or for all the customers in the database. But let's say you are European sales representative, and then continental states, different areas, and you want to limit only to certain users.
To be quite honest, because well, then you need to know the user, right? So we're talking here, we'll probably have something called a client principal object then. I'm very optimistic here, but I can then put in my activation procedure of the session, I will say, okay, so I want to know who that user is. and based on the user, I maybe want to get that here as well and say, okay, so and now I know which user it is, and that user is linked to, and I do my query first, which region he is linked to, and then I put that into. It's fully up to you what you want to do with that kind of information. It's not restrictive in any form. So if you're saying we want to do something with the user data, be my guest, as long as it's available in the ABL session, you can use it.
That would mean that all these methods need to be reprogrammed in that sense, that this username should be checked. Or any general methods to check something like users or
I think in that case, what happens here is that you would only get the you can have different ways of getting the user based on a header, authorization header, for example. But you could create your own header as well. But then there needs to be a way to recognize from the HTTP request coming in from the web handler whether whether there's information about the user or not, or that it doesn't care. But it could. But you need to be sure is that it's actually in there, and then you can use that user from wherever. But likely, it makes more sense maybe if you already have such a construction within maybe existing .p's, is that you just refer to that basically saying in the web handler, okay, so you're saying something with well, let's say sales rep or whatever, and that's your endpoint that you're calling, and somehow I'm getting the user as well, and I'm putting that basically saying in the handle get, so this is the HTTP request coming in. There is somewhere in there, there's the user as well, and then I'll just call a .p, which is able of doing something with that user and saying I'm doing a query for a certain user, and then I know is that user belongs to a certain region, so I first find the region, then do the actual query, return the results, and return that to the client, basically.
Is there some pre-built support for authenticating via the API?
Yes, we do have, that's what I was talking about earlier, that whole Spring security mechanism that we have. So basically that says, that's even upfront, right? That's on web server level, actually. So what will happen, let's say a client either first needs to authenticate or will send an OAuth2 token. I'm just saying something. Could be a XAML token. Could be anything, and that's what I was saying. That's usually in the header of a request by the client, in the authorization header. And so the Spring Security Framework, what it will do, it will say, okay, so based on whatever you provided in that authorization header, and I know is that the authentication method is set for this instance or for this ABL application to OAuth2, that could be an authentication method, then it will basically verify whatever token you provided, verify that against your identity management solution that you're using, which could be third party, could be Azure Directory, Azure Active Directory for my for whatever, basically, and then replace that or verify it, and if it's verified, it will again then replace that and convert it into a client principal token, which you then again in turn you can use in the OpenEdge application. So if you're looking at this one, so this API is actually built on a multi-tenant database. So you didn't see me having to log in because I already logged in and I'm using basic authentication. I wouldn't, that's not a best practice, but it is an authentication method. But I actually was logging in with a user at tenant 2, for example. So I was already doing certain things within the context of the tenant. So in my activation procedure of this application server, I said, okay, get client principal object. What is it? Set client, set DB client, basically saying, this is me. And from that point on, basically everything that it does for that session is based on my user. And my user belongs to a certain security domain, certain tenant, and it will only retrieve data for that tenant. So that already happens automatically, but that's the whole thing about multi-tenancy. Obviously, is that as soon as you have set your identity correctly, then it will only get data from that tenant that you're subscribed to, that you're part of. Does that make sense? But there's a lot of basic, so there's a lot of out-of-the-box authentication methods available within the new application server, which obviously will only work for clients that support that authentication mechanism. And what I mean with that is that the application server is capable of doing that, but an ABL client, let's say client server ABL client, is not able of doing that out of the box. You need to do stuff yourself. But this should work for most authentication methods. For your at least for your APIs, you could say, okay, we have different security models for my traditional clients, my Dynamics clients. They are just, they're going to still use that same old mechanism that we were using. Maybe nothing. Maybe very. Maybe it's from an ABL perspective. It's a sort of, or from a PASOE perspective, it's a no authentication method, but you have built your own thing. But in that case, it's at the end you could potentially tap into everything, all of the modern authentication mechanisms, especially with this, and it's just a matter of configuration basically. Setting up the correct configurations for OAuth 2, setting up the correct things for your certificate key stores, those kind of things. It's all configurable.
At least the users are the information is needed for audit trail or things like that. But sometimes also the restrict users, of course.
So that's what I'm saying. So you want to set your user for the session, absolutely, because that's gonna depend whatever is written wide in the audit trail, for example. Yes. But in this case, for this one, that would be in the activate procedure of the session. That's where you actually retrieve that from the client principal object, basically, which is created by Spring automatically, and then you can basically get that information and put it wherever you want. Yeah. Okay.
Kan die had het ook